have my microphone with me. I had to run back and get that. I had to walk back and get that. There's a common misunderstanding or a misperception about the job of the prophet. Quite often today we take one part of the job description of prophet and we kind of blow that up to become the whole meaning. And so when somebody predicts or foretells a future event, we say that person was a prophet. And the truth is, at least from a biblical standpoint, the truth about prophets is really more involved and more interesting than that. Because in Old Testament times, somebody who was called to prophecy, somebody who was called to prophesy by God, was being empowered and employed by God to tell people not just what was going to happen, but why it was going to happen. Their job was to stand up and face the powers that be and say, this isn't right. Their job was to stand up and face society and say, what you're doing is wrong. It was not often a popular job. Now, Jeremiah, the son of a priest, was tapped by God as a prophet 2,700 years ago. And he didn't want to do it at first. He pled youth and inexperience, to which God said, I don't care. You're doing it. And when you say, no, I'm not, and God says, oh, yes, you are, guess who wins? So he did it. And Jeremiah spent literally decades of his life after that walking through the streets, walking around Jerusalem, walking around his homeland, buttonholing anybody who would listen, grabbing people by the lapels, whatever they had for lapels in those days, and shaking them and saying, listen to me. And he particularly attracted the attention of the 5 kings who would reign during the time of this active prophecy, because he had a long career. Most of it he spent walking around the kingdom, predicting that Babylon was going to invade and smash them flat. And of course that did happen late in the 6th century BC. And you hear that and you think, of course, well then he was foretelling the future. And I guess he was. But if you look out the window and you see 2 cars heading toward an intersection on crossed streets, and they're both speeding, and you say, I think there's going to be an accident, and there is an accident. Does that make you a prophet, or does that just make you somebody that understands what was happening and what the end result was going to be? So for Israel, with Babylon on one side and Egypt on the other, with important and lucrative trade routes running through their land. And remember, this was an era when empires were constantly flexing their muscle to acquire new territory and wealth, and diplomacy in those days meant hitting your neighbor over the head until they apologized. How hard really was it to predict that there was going to be a crushing and disastrous invasion? So in that sense, at least Jeremiah's prediction of devastation might be seen as less a product of divine inspiration and more a matter of just understanding geopolitics in the 6th century BC. But knowing that doesn't negate what he was saying, and it doesn't negate his mission. Because his primary mission wasn't to predict what was going to happen. Jeremiah was not focused on the politics. He wasn't focused on the strategies. He was focused on the why of the coming destruction. And for Jeremiah, the answer was simple. The hammer was about to fall on Jerusalem because the people of Jerusalem and the people of the surrounding territory, God's people, at least they had been, they turned their back on God. Jeremiah, when he began his prophetic ministry, he looked at the people around him in his country and what was going on, and he saw, to coin a phrase, a basket of deplorables. He saw this disunited, self-serving, unrighteous mob of people, led by kings who were pretty much like they were. And that was his message. The rest of it about the coming disaster and everything, that was just to get their attention. His message was, you guys are messed up. The people of God, these were the people whose ancestors God had made covenant with. So far in the past that there wasn't even rain. They were the people whose ancestors had been led out of captivity in Egypt and through the wilderness and into this fruitful, promised land by a succession of divine miracles. If you look back on everything that happened to them, there was no saying, well, that was just, happenstance. It was just good luck. God obviously was leading them. And the people whose very existence was defined by covenants and rituals that were meant to bind them to the God who loved them and wanted their love in return. These people had turned their backs on God. And it had been a long process. Generations before, against the advice of God, the people of Israel had chosen to be led by a king instead of this kind of loose organization of judges. They wanted a king. They wanted to be like their neighbors. Everybody else has a king. Why can't we? God, like any parent worn down by his children, finally said, fine, have a king. Not going to go with it. And the kings, as kings will, had been a mixture of good and bad, and righteous and not so righteous. Because the rule of kings is, after all, the rule of man. And that's what God had realized. And in the generations leading up to and including the time of Jeremiah, the people had continued to drift from a focus on binding themselves to God and worshiping God to a more, what we would call today, a more multicultural approach. And I will quickly say, this is not to say multiculturalism is bad. It's certainly not. Awareness of other cultures is important. But what happened over time is that the people, remember, God's chosen people, the ones God tapped on the shoulder and said, you guys are going to be the bearers of my message. They started to lose their grasp on the idea of being chosen. Instead, they became lost in the idea of fitting in. They became lost in the idea of becoming like their neighbors, losing their separateness, losing their identity. The Jewish people had a temple in Jerusalem, and that temple was God's place. And that's where they sacrificed. That's where they had the altar. But all around them, People worshipped different gods, and they built altars in many places. And the people of Israel saw this, and eventually they wanted to be like that. You can almost hear them. Well, Abigail gets to build altars wherever they want to. Why do we have to just have the one altar in Jerusalem? Abigail has lots of gods. Why do we just have the one? What's wrong with us? Abigail gets to sacrifice children to his God. Why do we have to stick to sheep and goats? How does that happen? And so in the context of that relationship with God and what it meant to them in the past, the children of Israel walked away from God. And they paid the consequences. And that's what Jeremiah was saying. That's what he was trying to get through to them. Walk away from God, pay the consequences. Walk away from God and God punishes you. Boom. Simple as that. Of course, even in biblical times, things were rarely quite that simple. Because I wonder, with all of the bad that's out there, with all of the bad that just keeps kind of rolling on, is God really in the nation punishing business? The way Jeremiah preached it. Or in the context of that time, was there maybe something else going on? I mean, there were some fairly evil empires by our standards that endured for a very long time and were not punished, from what we can tell. And there were some seriously bad emperors and kings, some very, very bad dudes, who had long reigns and lived to ripe old ages. Why weren't they punished? I puzzle over that. Then this week, looking at the gospel, I think we get part of the answer. This week, well, really 2,000 years ago, but this week is when we read it, Jesus kind of gives an answer to that question. At its start, even before its start, the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, were chosen to serve God, and they did that faithfully, generally speaking. And they served faithfully. They did what God said. They were unified. And they prospered. And then the success set in. Maybe it was what we called in sociology class was cultural ennui. Just got tired of the way things were. Maybe they got tired of always being the good guys and always following the rules. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was just simple human nature and that entropy of evil that seems to go hand in hand with power and success. But whatever it was, the people who had been set aside to serve God by the time of Jeremiah certainly found themselves serving other masters. Personal power and greed. Sometimes they served other undeserving nations by making alliances with the neighbors where they were not the sort of neighbors you should have alliances with. As I alluded to, they served other gods. These were gods that were, first of all, false, and second of all, Not very nice. And there was just this simple ego gratification that was going on, which set their needs above God's. So they made themselves masters, in a sense. And all of these things happened, and there was a predictable result. The people of Israel lost themselves. They lost that special cohesion that had made them a force to be reckoned with, and they lost that cultural strength that made them a people who stood united in the face of the world if need be. They lost that specialness that made them something different. They lost that specialness that made it okay not to be like every other nation, not to be like your neighbors. And then they learned the lesson that Jesus would teach 600 years later. When you serve two masters, you can't serve them both well. You end up ditching one in favor of the other. And in the case in point, 6th century BC, the people forgot who they were and they weakened themselves when they turned away from God. And when they did that, when they weakened themselves, they made themselves prey to whatever empire chose to crush them first. In this case, it was the Babylonians. And when they did that, it cost them their nation, and it cost them their temple. It nearly cost them their national identity, because so many of them were then shipped off. They were deported to Babylon, where the idea was they would not be a threat. It was a dark, dark time. Jeremiah knew instinctively truth. That nations are born and they mature and they grow and they age and they die. And whether they do so gracefully can be tied to which masters that nation serves. Do they know who they are? Do they know what they stand for? Or do they just become whoever is convenient? Do they stand for whatever satisfies them for the moment? Those are questions that nations need to ask themselves. They're questions that people need to ask themselves as well. Who am I? What do I stand for? Do I just stand for whatever looks shiny right now? Or do I stand for something more principled? And those are questions I'm going to encourage you to think about this week. I encourage you to think about them because we're going to come together again next week and explore the question of what it looks like when we serve one master. What does it look like when we serve God? How will we do that?